Welcome to the Art of Procurement, the official podcast of the Catalyst Co-community. And our purpose is to enhance the impact of procurement by elevating the discussion, one conversation at a time. Here at Art of Procurement, Catalysts come together every single week to share their challenges, ideas, successes, and perspectives on the business of procurement. Hi there everybody and welcome to this week's show. I'm the host, Philip Eidson. So, how would you buy a gorilla? Well, the good news is that that's a figurative question rather than a literal one. In fact, it's the title of the book written by today's guest, David Meikle. The gorilla in question was an award-winning 2007 TV advert in the UK. It was created to advertise Cadbury's chocolate. The advert in question was a 90-second shot of an actor dressed up in a gorilla costume, playing the drums to the Phil Collins song In the Air Tonight. The ad, though, was considered a runaway success. So in short, How to Buy a Gorilla is all about buying creative services using advertising as an example, with a focus on creating productive relationships between procurement, internal marketing, and advertising agencies. David, he has a deep background in advertising, including work with some of the world's most iconic brands. He's worked with a number of different agencies, such as Ogilvy and Mather, where most latterly he was the managing director of their Russia business. I've got to know David really well over the summer. He originally was introduced to me by Rory Sutherland. Rory, you may recall, was our guest in episode 193. And while our conversation is based on the advertising business, the principles that we discuss can actually be applied to any people-based creative services where success might be difficult to define, but that it really requires an alchemy that goes way beyond the contract to create an environment that enables the creative individuals who you want to bring together into a project team. We really want to enable them to do their best work. So we discuss topics such as signaling, the RFP process, aligning incentives, and many more. Now, in my first question for David, I actually asked if he could just share a little bit more about his marketing background.
Well, like many people, I sort of fell into advertising. It wasn't necessarily my first choice of career because I hadn't really made a choice. But it was suggested to me in a pub, as often happens, that I would probably be quite good at it because of my character. So at the time I kind of thought, well, why not have a look? So I started off in smaller provincial agencies and a regional marketing job. And then I was told I ought to go to London. So that's what I did. So in 1995, I think I took my first job in a London agency, which was Grey Worldwide, and cut my teeth in a big bad world of advertising then for 5 years and worked on pastes and pills and powders and pet food, which was mostly what Grey handled at the time. Yeah. But then I got into more interesting stuff like Ben Sherman shirts, and for those who are old enough to remember, a financial services company called Allied Dunbar, which was
I remember
a very famous campaign. And in 2000, I moved to Ogilvy to work on BP. So we were launching the BP brand globally and launching a new retail offer called BP Connect, which is still going now. So I was responsible for launching that across Europe and new fuels products and so on. And I did a bit of work on GSK and so on. And then around about middle of 2003, I was approached by the owner of an Ogilvy affiliate called Leonid, and his name might be the clue that he was the owner of Ogilvy Russia.
Right.
And he asked me if I wanted to go and work out there. So I kind of thought, well, why the hell not? I'd always regretted never doing the foreign exchange when I was at school. So what better opportunity? So the chance to go as managing director and run a brick market for Ogilvy was just fantastic. So, yes, I jumped at the chance and went out there at the end of 2003. 4 years later, the business was 500% bigger by revenue, 300% bigger by staff. We'd got the top spot on all of our clients' rosters. It was a great time, frightening and exciting at the same time. But those are stories for another time. I came back to the collapse of Lehman Brothers.
Yeah.
Which wasn't the
perfect
best timing. Yes, you can imagine the appetite for expensive senior management of advertising agencies on my return to the UK, and that's when I started a business called Salt, which was just it was called Salt as a symbol of value, and I had always been troubled by the pub conversations that advertising agency people have, usually when they're on the brink of depression and despair. Which is, if only we could do this, or if only clients would do that, we could do so much better.
Yeah.
And I set myself the task of how can clients and agencies operate more effectively than they currently do to create greater value. And I stuck at that through thick and thin and through the global financial crisis and so on, until I found an answer. And that's what I wrote up into my book, How to Buy a Gorilla. And thinking that the book would upstage the company fairly quickly, I quickly renamed the company before the book came out.
You probably had some interesting questions before the book came out of why you're renaming your company to How to Buy a Gorilla. It's not your it's not your typical company name, is it?
No, quite. Calling the bank to say there might be some interesting transfers going up was quite fun. But yes, as soon as you say it's the title of a book as well, they seem to kind of get it.
Where did procurement come in then?
Well, the interesting thing about setting myself this task was that I couldn't have done it, and I realised only retrospectively that I couldn't have set about finding a way of working together better when I was working in an ad agency. Yeah. Likewise, I don't think I could have done it if I was in procurement or if I was in marketing. I actually had to step outside of all three and look at them completely objectively and impartially without any interest in what the result might be. And a big part of that equation was not just how clients work with agencies, but how clients pay agencies and incentivize agencies. So it was really important for me to understand, because procurement has been on the rise and continues to rise since it saved the US car industry back in the 60s. Yeah. And it's an increasingly relevant and important role in business. So to develop a solution that was only in my knowledge zone of marketing and agencies would have been naive and unhelpful. So what I needed was a holistic view of how these three parties can work together, and hence I set about learning a lot more about procurement than I ever knew.
Right. Were there things that you found that surprised you, perhaps from the preconceived ideas that you had going into that conversation and that journey of discovery?
There were a few things that surprised me. There's a level of sophistication that I wasn't aware of in the thinking. There is well, let me put it another way. Any agency believes that they're suitable for your business. Yeah. And there is a widespread naivety, particularly in the small agencies that are young and enthusiastic and hungry, that size isn't a problem, the fact that they haven't been around isn't a problem. But when you understand the role of procurement is about risk mitigation in the supply chain, as much as it's about many other aspects of their role, then, if you've just opened your doors 6 months ago with three partners who've left an agency, how do I know you're going to be around in another 6 months? So there was a business-to-business diligence level to which I'd been entirely naive, because the environments that I'd been in had always been qualified. So, I was in Grey Worldwide, which was a huge network at that time, not part of WPP. Yeah. Then I was in WPP. Yeah. So questions like that didn't really arise. You'd already passed that part of a PQQ. You were already in. Yeah, and it was only when I was out of that I started to learn those sorts of things, and they made enormous amounts of sense. And procurement strategy and buying strategies and hierarchies of need, things like that, I'd never been aware of before.
So I want to go a little bit into kind of behind the scenes at an agency, because I think that from my perspective, I've bought marketing, but I've done it as a generalist, not a specialist. And so
Right.
I think I've probably been as guilty as the next person in pushing, I don't want to say entirely pushing traditional procurement processes, but using those as my base, because they often cover for a lack of market knowledge in a particular industry or a particular category. Now, there's relational things to it too, which you can layer on top of it. But at least an approach, if you don't know the market, then you kind of applying the same process as you would do for anything that you buy. So
Yes.
So with that being my background, what does the typical ad buying model look like? And how do the agency, how do procurement, how do marketing all typically work together?
Well, in terms of the buying, if you ask 100 agencies in marketing services, pretty much, let's include everything except the sort of downstream production, by which I mean the Tag Worldwides, the Splashes, those big operators that duplicate and distribute and adapt. But if you take PR, direct marketing, digital, traditional advertising, media agencies, whichever, and you ask them with a buying matrix how they experience the procurement buying process, then it is pretty much universal that they say this is a leverage buy. And by a leverage buy means that the buyer believes that they can ensure the quality measures such that they can exploit their buying power to achieve the best price.
Yeah.
Which kind of goes back to the Kraujic stuff of long ago, although it wasn't designed for this particular sector. But that's how they experience it, and that's how I experienced it. The client's procurement guys want to come and negotiate with you, and they turn up with, metaphorical crash helmets and baseball bats. And it was always very difficult. And what's particularly difficult is that if you haven't differentiated in advance the difference between a cost and an investment, then procurement think they're doing a great job in reducing cost, where actually they're doing a very easy job in reducing investment. So they can go away air punching, say, hey, I've saved 50%. Fantastic. Well, yeah, you just spent less and you should expect a lower return or a higher risk because it's an investment, not a cost.
So how do agencies then attempt to portray the value that they can provide in what a procurement person may come and look at it as being a commoditized market? Lots of agencies out there, they all do the same thing. I know that this is very basic, and I'm being very generalistic, I guess, in the way that I'm portraying it. But if you look at it and say lots of people, they all look the same, they all have same quality people, at least as an outsider, how does an agency deal with that in trying to differentiate themselves?
It's very difficult for an agency to differentiate itself. I mean, I encourage agencies and I encourage clients to differentiate agencies by looking at two factors. One is the size and scale and reach, so how big they are, and therefore, as a prospective client of that agency, what would be your relative supplier preference financially? Yeah. So that's one aspect, and the other one that I look at in differentiating agencies is how strong is their employer brand. So in the agency market, is this a go-to agency, a run-from agency, or a stay-at agency? If it's a go-to agency, then they're punching above. Well, they're punching their weight in terms of getting the great talent. They're not having to overpay for good talent. People want to go and work there because of the people there and because of the brands that they work on. If it's a run from agency, then this is just a passing through place where actually it's not going to do my reputation much good. The thing about agencies is that they are just repositories for talent. And the value that you get from an agency as a client is entirely dependent upon the talent that's assigned to your business. Yeah. And the talent that is assigned to your business is determined entirely consistently between management and the individual. Because if you're the individual, then you want to work on the best available client in the best available agency, because that's how you get on. That's how you progress in your career. So if I'm working on a really good piece of business and someone says, hey, can you come and help me out on this really shoddy piece of business? The answer is most likely to be no, because I see no reason why I'd want to do that. And it's not going to enhance my reputation, and it's not going to increase my value. But equally, if you are running an agency and you've got a difficult client who's not producing particularly interesting work, who's not very happy with you, and is table thumping and screaming at you, all you're going to do is pacify them. You're not going to put your best people on that business for the simple reasons that if you put the best people on that business, they will stop being the best people because the client can't get that kind of value from them. Yeah. Or they'll leave because they're the best people and they can get a job somewhere else. So there's a much more organic way in which talent works in an agency. You can't force better service. You can't force better ideas. It's an environment in which you need to encourage and attract talent and then motivate it to deliver for you. And that's a much more artful, skillful thing to do than to go in and place an order for something and then the product comes out at the end. This is why the leverage buying strategy is a particular problem, because you cannot ensure quality measures of something that hasn't been created yet.
So how, as an outsider, there's a couple of things I actually want to jump on for there. One is how you're managing an agency when you have them, in terms of wanting to be an attractive customer. But the first one is around, as an outsider, and you're trying to determine or separate agencies from others as you're making a buying decision. What are some of the factors or flags to look at that determines whether an agency is one that does have that client, that talent, that high level of talent, or is more of a, I think the term was run through agency, but one that's really just exists, but it's more of a shell and people come and go. Yeah.
Well, leadership reputation is a big part of that. There are fewer what you would describe as rock stars in the business anymore, but there are nonetheless rock stars. And if you really get under the skin of agencies and understand who's who, then you can see how they might recruit to greater strengths with an amazing planner or an amazing business leader or an amazing executive creative director. So there are ways like that. In terms of their ability to retain talent, you can ask them.
Yep.
You can look at things like best places to work charts. You can look at things like the kind of policies that they have for their staff, and you can ask questions about what are the kind of things that you do to retain staff. You can look at how much they spend on training. You can look at how they invest in their people, and all of these kind of things make an agency sticky. There isn't one thing,
right?
There are a number of different things.
Yeah, not a single thing that you can look at that says that's the measure, but it's getting more of a holistic perspective, perhaps by asking questions you may not have thought about asking before, because
that's right.
You're not always looking at talent; you're just looking at deliverables or perceived ability to deliver.
Exactly, but what you're using the employer brand strength as a proxy for value.
Yeah.
So once you've established that the value is in that agency, then the task is extracting that value from those people. But at least you're fishing in the right pond. And that's the first step.
And the second part of that, which was around customer of choice, so you've found an agency. They're a really strong agency. They have top of the line talent. But obviously once you're among other clients that they support, you're still fighting for the best people internally, and for the best people to be put on your account. And as you mentioned before, the best people have options. They're not going to go onto an account that doesn't inspire or interest them, because they're highly talented individuals and they can move on to another agency if they feel like they're just being put on stuff they don't want to do. So how, as a client, can I make it as attractive as possible? And I'm saying this, I guess, if we take away money as a motivator, because we've already made the buying decision, what are some of the things that I can do as a client to make my account more attractive for your team?
There are a number of things. To start with, there are some clients who don't need to. There are some clients who are just so attractive because of their brand fame or their brand reputation that agencies will just fall over themselves to work on their business. And they will, so that if you're a mid-range agency and you get a chance to have Coca-Cola as a name on your website, then you're not going to be bothered about whether or not they're a real pain to work for.
You'll do anything.
You're just going to say, that's not something we're going to compromise. Yeah, I know it may not be making anything more than contribution, but we're going to put great people on that business and we're going to deliver against.
Yeah.
So your Coca-Colas, your McDonald's, your Nikes and so on, there are certain brands that can exploit their popularity. The really good ones choose not to. Mm-hmm. So the Nikes, the McDonald's, they choose not to exploit that reputation. By and large, they're brands that people want to work on. There are a number of things that depend upon the client's business problem that then determine how you work with your agency. And part of the thing here, and maybe it's something we should address now-ish, is that there isn't one answer to the question that you're asking. Mm-hmm. And the reason that there isn't one answer is that every single account is necessarily unique because you can't have two brands that are identical. Yeah. So on that basis, every single brand's problem is different and their ability to attract talent is different. And the strategy by which they do it is going to be consistent with their brand, and that's different. Mm-hmm. So the ways that they work, what they do, their appetite for creativity in the broadest sense, so an interesting strategy, an interesting channel mix, an interesting creative idea, an interesting executional idea, all of these sorts of things can make a brand more interesting. Their capacity to listen to their agency, their ability to instill trust in the relationship, their give and take. For some clients, frankly, a lot of the time, if they just said thank you a lot more, then the agencies would be running in circles.
Yeah.
Equally, if I pointed out to a procurement group once a few years ago, how do I get more out of my agencies? Well, just tell them that they'll get a £10,000 bonus if they get one of their ads into an awards show and win a gold. Mm-hmm. If one of your ads wins a gold, you get a £10,000 bonus. They're not interested in the £10,000 bonus. They're saying, do you know this client wants to win creative awards? Yeah. And then suddenly you'll have everyone staying late working on that business trying to get an award on it. So there are lots of ways that you can do it. You just kind of have to understand how to not game the agency, but motivate the agency consistent with your business need. If you are a risk-averse client in a stale category that's in decline, that buys boring advertising only so that its competitors don't occupy the void it would create if you didn't advertise, and then you say, I want award-winning advertising, let's try and win an award and I'll give you a bonus. The agency's not going to buy it. They're not suckers. But if you are a brand that really has that capacity and you really have that ambition, then you can certainly get a lot more people working a lot harder in their own time to try and realize it. Agencies, one of the things that clients tend to forget is that agencies, generally speaking, want to do good work for their clients. Yeah. They generally want to see their clients succeed and do well. So when it starts going really badly, the client really needs to examine itself and check what they're doing and why they're doing it. A lot of what I've done before I took time out to write my book, a lot of what I did was agency relationship management and looking at how clients and agencies are working together. One of the problems is that the decision makers and the owners of the relationship are often too far away from the front line to see that there's battles and scrapping going on the front lines, but actually they've got a nice relationship at the top, so they think everything's okay. Yeah. And you can lose sight of the day-to-day business and the struggles and the strains of the day-to-day business partly because everyone on both sides of that issue are trying to keep it from you because you're the leader, and they don't want you to know that it's scrappy and difficult.
Yeah, they want you to think everything's great because then
absolutely.
it makes their lives easier.
Exactly. So you have to really want to get under the skin of all of these things where it's messy, and it is messy, and it's also quite difficult because one rule with one agency won't apply on a different brand with another agency, even though it's for the same client. Mm-hmm. Because everything that we're talking about is relative to that agency and its other clients. It's not relative to you, it's relative to them. And one has to have the self-awareness to know whether or not you are a core client or a nuisance client, or a bread and butter day-to-day client, or a rising star. Yeah. The added problem there in terms of really understanding your supplier preference is find an agency that says you're not a core client.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because I was having this conversation with a client of mine this morning. Every client thinks that they're a core client.
Yeah.
And the reason that they think that they're a core client is their agencies tell them that they're a core client.
There's nothing in it for the agency not to tell you that.
Oh, quite. I mean, when did you last hear an agency MD say, you know what, it's not a very challenging category you're in and you don't like buying exciting work, so I've got a bunch of safe pairs of hands working on your business. It's not going to make your market share fly, but you know what? We'll be here in a year's time and we can play golf again.
Yeah, it pays our bills.
Exactly. It keeps our doors open. It keeps your CEO happy, so let's just carry on repeating behaviour. I mean, no one has those conversations. They'll find some believable way to say that you're a really important client, and then vanity does the rest of it. Yeah. Because who would want to believe they're not?
You mentioned about, every brand challenge is different. There's something that there's no one size fits all in terms of the challenges of each account, and yet we tend to buy as if that's what we're solving for, is to push everyone into a common, as I think of what one of our typical tactics in procurement is supplier consolidation, and we have companies working with 10 agencies. We really want to work with one or two and put all of our eggs in their baskets, and we'll all be much happier because we'll have a stronger relationship and everything that comes with that kind of narrative. And yet, with each challenge being different, is that the right approach? I'm really interested in your opinion. Should we be buying using a single agency or a couple of agencies versus going and finding agencies that are more specialized in specific challenges we may have?
Okay, there's two different questions there from what I heard. One is about a principle of best practice, i.e. on a macro scale, forget supplier consolidation, but supplier consolidation might be one part of it. But is there this best practice that we should all be going for and aspiring to? Mm-hmm. And the other is the specific question about supplier consolidation. If I go first to best practice is, I think, one of the biggest misnomers in the industry ever, because you cannot replicate what another client is doing in the belief that that's going to suit you too, because you're different. One of the best examples of this is that if you look at a business like Procter & Gamble, the amount of ways of working, of protocols in the development of creative work that have come from P&G and then been seeded into other organizations and become part of their way of working is incalculable.
Yeah.
But they seeded into another organization which isn't a portfolio business like Procter & Gamble. So Procter & Gamble have to be very careful when they advertise one of their hair care brands that they don't cannibalize another one of their hair care brands in the same category. So they have to be regimentally precise about the strategy, the creative targeting, the target audience, the media planning. And in return for that certainty of return and the certainty of that process, they will get a safe degree of growth, which is usually often determined by their excess share of voice, rather than necessarily groundbreaking creative work. Now, someone then in a category with a single brand in the category, whose source of business is all other brands in the category, uses a process that is designed to limit the brand's growth such that it doesn't eat its brothers, sisters, and cousin brands.
Yeah.
And then they think, oh, well, that company over there has done really well with that, so why don't we do that? Well, the reason you don't do that is you've got a different business problem, because your source of business is everybody, and their source of business is quite specific. So why on earth would you be so prescriptive? People tend not to think back up to the whole business problem or the whole business strategy. They tend to operate on a brand level, and that's how they develop effective creative work. The other problem there is that there is this consistent idea of what great creative work looks like from a client perspective, which is very much at odds with what great creative work looks like from an agency perspective. So this best practice idea of, you don't start a brief by saying we want something safe and predictable. You say we want something breakthrough and amazing. Yeah. Well, when an agency hears breakthrough and amazing, they've got a whole different paradigm of what breakthrough and amazing means compared to a client. So they go off and try and do breakthrough and amazing stuff, and the client then looks horrified when this breakthrough and amazing work comes along, because actually we just wanted something that was still in the same 30-second format, but just a little bit edgy.
Yeah, it was safe, but maybe a little bit less safe than we would usually do.
Exactly. Yeah. So this whole idea of best practice is something that I challenge fundamentally. Insofar as business problems need to be the start point of ways of working and ways of paying. And the business problem determines a necessary risk profile for your investment in terms of how much you've got to spend on media, how much you ought to be spending on an idea that will populate that media. And therefore, how much freedom, latitude you necessarily need to give your agency in order to produce work that is of an appropriate risk profile to deliver against your business needs. And that's the way the How to Buy Guerrilla framework works. So if I was to then move to the subset of best practice, which is this idea of supplier consolidation, there are some instances in which supplier consolidation is a very good idea. So if you are, for example, if you are playing it safe and you want safe, predictable growth, you can consolidate all of your brands into one agency rather than managing a roster of agencies, and thereby vastly improve your relative importance to that agency. So a good example of this would be if you look at AMV BBDO in the UK. They are getting excellent creative work for their brands. They've won prizes, and they've seen massive growth on brands like Maltesers. Their global Snickers ad with Mr. Bean was incredibly successful. But if you look at how they buy, then they have every confectionery brand, every pet food brand. I think even is Uncle Ben's Mars. I think even that's with them. Their chewing gum brands, everything is with that agency. So they have a huge amount of priority. Yeah. And it's not a cheap agency. Yeah. It's not an inexpensive agency. It's one of the premium agencies, let's say that. Because there is security in the knowledge that the worst talent in an agency like that is probably better than much of the middle or even best talent of other agencies.
Yeah, so it's an investment in protecting the brand as much as it is in the worst case, I guess that's the risk mitigation, is we're paying more, but we're protecting it, and then there may be upside because of all these other reasons why they're a brand that we want to go, they're an agency that we want to actually work with.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we need to unpick a lot of the assumptions that we make about how we do what we do, because we don't see the indirect impact that they have on the value that we're trying to procure. When we're unpicking those different things, we need to think about what our buying strategy actually is. And we need to better differentiate between the principles of what is a leverage buy and what is a strategic buy, and perhaps to some degree what is a critical buy. So your critical, which is your bottleneck, which is where you've got low buying power and what I would call a high or a limited availability of access to talent, or a high variability of the return. Let's put that to one side and concentrate on big agencies and big clients. So you're either buying in a manner which is consistent with a leverage buy, or you're buying with a strategic buy. Now, I've asked this question of a number of people in procurement and said, what is a strategic buy in your book? And they've said it's a big supplier.
We spend a lot of money. It's all about the amount of money we spend.
Exactly. Yeah. And actually it's not. And that is the biggest mistake of the whole process, because actually what's really difficult and is counterintuitive to a lot of the way that people have cut their teeth in procurement is a strategic buy is a supplier with whom you have a mutual interest in your mutual success. Mm-hmm. There is a mutuality of creating a long-term, ever-improving, ever-managed relationship of value creation. A critical buy is a seller's market, a leverage buy is a buyer's market, and in the middle is this one which is meant to be symbiotic. Now, if you were to assume that my definition, then if you were to adopt my definition of a strategic buy, and you were to say, okay, so let's look at all of my strategic partners, then you would have to ask, is the manner in which I remunerate and incentivize this agency consistent with the mutuality that I've just described? Mm-hmm. And in most instances, it isn't, because it's either based on mistrust, and therefore, we need to audit the agencies, and we need to look at the timesheets, and we need to check all of this and check all of that. And actually, a lot of the time, this kind of defensive protective behavior is inconsistent with getting the best talent allocated to your business and in that agency. Because anything that's restricting the agency's ability to improve margin by delivering greater value faster is becoming anything that's limiting that is becoming a leverage buy. If an agency, there's if you're familiar with the agency, and normally they don't work by timesheets at all. They won't charge by time. And a question I was told, and this is hearsay, I was told that their CEO was asked, if you manage to solve a creative problem in half the time, why shouldn't I give you half the money? And his answer was, well, if I solve it in half the time, why don't you give me double the money?
Yeah, there's money to be had for speed.
Exactly.
Yeah. I want to come back to incentives, but talking about the concept of strategic buy, and we talked a little bit earlier about segmentation, and how we segment suppliers in terms of how we then work with them, how we engage with them.
Yes.
And as we talk to marketing professionals, marketing folks will always tell us that, well, buying an agency and buying creative work is different, and that it all belongs in that the quadrant which is reserved for the most important suppliers, and we should approach it like that. But then the reality is that that's not necessarily always the case, and so it's hard for us to differentiate when it is and when it isn't, so that we can actually apply the right strategy. So I wonder if you have any advice of the kind of questions that we can be asking as procurement professionals of our marketing peers to truly understand when something is a strategic buy.
The first question would be, what is it that you want to achieve from the engagement with the agency? If you want something which is transformational creative work, if you want a strategy and ideas blossoming from that strategy that are going to change your brand perception and transform your fortunes, then you're not going to get that by playing hardball and nickel and diming on the way you remunerate your agency. You're going to get that by using a strategic buy in the terms that I described earlier. So what is it that you want from it? I think that equally, the other thing that you need to do is look at your business position. If your business position is that, we've just made an acquisition that cost us $10 billion, so cash is at a premium at the moment, we really need to cut back. Tell your agency that that's the problem.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean cut the agency's margin, because that won't do you any good, and agencies will pretty much refuse because they've learned that they'll never get it back. But if you share your business problem with your agency, then they might say, well, we could take the expression of your brand in this direction, which might be less expensive in terms of production. There are different ways. There was a whole agency called Hal Henry Chaldecott Lurie was a big creative shop back in the 90s and the noughties that was famous for producing amazing ads in the UK, most notably Tango. And one of their propositions is a great idea needn't cost more than £150,000 to make.
Yeah, you don't need over elaborate sets and locations and everything that
Not
goes into
necessarily.
that for it to be
Exactly.
still be effective.
Exactly, and it's much better to say, listen, we've got a big cash problem, so please don't open on a beach with your script, than it is to kind of say, well, show us what you can do, and then try and rein them back, because they'll go and do what, in all good faith, what they think they ought to do. Yeah. I mean, this is a debate that I've had with a number of people in procurement, which plays to another thing, which is budgets.
Yeah,
and I've kind of argued almost endlessly that agencies need to be given budgets when they're given a brief for a campaign. You need to say, this is how much we want to invest in original production. This is how much we've allocated for downstream production. If you're accepting that with the brief, then that's what you need to go off and fix. Mm-hmm. Now, the pushback that I get from the procurement community is usually, but if we give an agency a budget, they'll spend it.
Right. And we don't know what they'll spend it on and whether that's the right amount of money. Right.
Now, the thing is that if I went to my financial advisor and said, I'd like a pension, and he said, well, how much do you want to put in it? And I said, well, yeah, just give me some options. Mm-hmm. I need to know how much I want to invest in terms of the return that I want. So if you don't know how much you want to spend, then you need to say, I actually don't know.
Yeah.
And this is the job that it's got to do, or get the agency to help you establish a budget. But if you give an agency a budget, of course they'll spend it, because that's how much you're investing in doing it. But the greater irony of it is that, I mean, I've made countless TV commercials as a let's take a high spend area of agency production. And each time, if I've had a budget, on the rare occasions that I have, or we've agreed as part of the process that this is a threshold, the costs that come into the agency are always exceeding that. Mm-hmm. So if the argument that procurement give is, if I give you a £500,000 budget, then you'll come back with a cost of £499,999. Yes, I will, because I've optimized your spend. And actually, it should have been 560, but I've negotiated everything I can to get it within that.
Yeah.
So rather than representing something which is poor value because you've stretched it up, this is something which is representing high value, which has been constrained within. But because they're not part of that process, they don't see that happening.
I think one of the things that we struggle with is, and it's an area where we're getting better at for sure, is buying for, putting everything on the table in terms of a business problem and asking partners or potential partners to share in ways in which they would approach that, and what that would cost, as opposed to buying to spec, which is, our typical approach of here's what, and I think this comes from our direct procurement roots. You talked right at the beginning about the automotive industry. Our beginnings were around buying from engineering drawings and blueprints, and just saying, here's the blueprint, tell me what it's going to cost. And so we then struggle a little bit more when it's we're buying to solve a problem. Are we buying to create an opportunity? We still like to say, and this is all the things that it should do and have included in it, which then really hamstrings the participants in an RFP process, for example.
It does. And I think that what's very difficult is that when you're buying the solution to a problem with unlimited possible solutions, how do you get your head around what it is that you're actually buying? Mm-hmm. Because you're actually buying faith in a group of people's ability to solve that problem, rather than a tangible output, because that output won't exist until you've started paying them.
Yeah. No, that's
that's really hard.
Yeah, because if you're providing a specification, then you can have it's a question of, do you trust your people internally more to know the way to solve this problem, or do you trust your external partner more? And the reality is we should probably trust our external partners more because they're the experts. But what we end up doing, probably from a perceived risk mitigation, is trusting our own people, because we know that we're not going to get in trouble if we go and buy something that doesn't work, if it's been designed or defined by someone within our organization.
Yes, but that whole situation can be helped by better defining the business problem and the risk profile of the investment beforehand. So a lot of the time, what clients are asking for from agencies is huge, unprecedented growth for their brand.
Yeah.
But if you want huge, unprecedented growth for your brand and you're not changing the amount that you're spending, you're not buying market share with an excess share of voice. If that's not an option that's open to you, because that's the easiest way to do it, it's just buy market share.
Yeah.
By outspending everyone else. Now, if that option's not open to you, then you have to do something with what you've got. Now, if you currently use a formula or a rigid process to buy creativity and to buy creative strategy, then you can't repeat that formula and expect it to deliver something different. And I think it was Bill Bernbach, one of the founders of DDB, said nothing original was ever created from formula. And that's absolutely right. But you then have to therefore have the risk savviness to say, okay, we're going to do it slightly differently. Now, when you look at the ads that many clients aspire to, and the ones that I refer to, like the Cadbury Gorilla ad or the Sony San Francisco ad, those ads broke all the rules. And these are the ads that many clients aspire to. But then they say, well, can we have that, but can we have that with a little demonstration sequence in the middle? Can we have that, but we need to have heavier branding? Can we introduce the brand at the beginning? All the things that make it formula are the things that are actually working against it. And you have to have the ability to let go and say, okay, I'm going to have to be comfortable with this unknown space of originality. I was talking to a creative director. I went to a conference, an agency conference to talk a couple of months ago. And one of the creative directors there from TBWA Los Angeles said, I had a client who asked for first in category breakthrough idea. And I said, great. And he said, can you show me some case studies? Well, kind of no.
Yeah.
Because
it doesn't exist.
I mean, when you frame it in a short paraphrase like that, it's obviously ridiculous.
Yeah.
But that risk aversion is a big part of the problem in the returns. And when you look at the top 500 advertisers, I think it was the CEO of the ANA was observing a few months or a year ago that of the top 500, more than 250 aren't showing growth. And I'm sure that one reason for that, or one contributor to that, is the standard of the communications. The greatest tragedy is that most of these big agencies have got people in them that can write good work, that can write great strategies. You just have to get that value out. It's a bit like having a performance car and not knowing how to use a stick shift.
I want to talk about the pitch process a little bit, because that's something that you talked about a lot in How to Buy a Gorilla. There was a great example that you talked about with the post office, and that we actually chatted about as well before we recorded. Because we recognizing how many variables there are in buying creative work and how we can't put in place a rigid process that's going to apply to every single outcome that we're trying to drive and deliver. And yet we then go into an RFP process or a pitch process, which looks exactly the same, regardless of what we're trying to buy. I wonder if you could share some, how we can think about approaching that differently when it comes to creative work that still allows us to have a good sense for the risk mitigation, which, as we said earlier, when we talked about off mic, that even though I think that we obviously go through these processes to save money, what we really want to do is reduce the risk, and we want to feel as though we're getting value for money. And in creative work, and when we're buying people, we're not often clear about what that looks like. And so it's a risk mitigation process. So how can we go about doing that? How can we look a little bit differently at the RFP or the pitch process?
I think there's a lot of procurement models and processes which in principle bring a great deal of value and sense to the pitch process. So I think it's important to establish that I think that a procurement involvement in a pitch process, when calibrated correctly, is a very good and valuable thing. In terms of the diligence applied to how robust, how secure, how long lasting, all of these things on a business to business level, to which I alluded earlier, that usually aren't in the minds of the marketers or the agencies themselves. So establishing a good bedrock upon which you can say, yes, these are all agencies that I wouldn't be worried about dealing with if their work is good enough. I mean, basically using this procurement hierarchy of needs of assurance of supply, quality, service, cost, and then innovation. So using that kind of approach all makes enormous sense. I think that where it's gone wrong, and marketing, procurement, intermediaries and agencies are all guilty, is that the RFI went from a piece of market research into, what's the difference between all of these different agencies in this market, the services that they do, the size that they are, how long they've been around, who owns them, yada, yada, yada. It's meant to be a list of facts that are going to establish things like the assurance of supply of an agency. And they turned into some sort of beauty contest. How that happened, I've got no idea. But when I've run an RFI and said, for the love of God, just answer the questions below. Yeah. I know you're hungry. I know you're passionate. They all are. You are too. Registered. I paraphrase to make a point. But then received back a brochure, a video,
right.
An app preloaded onto iPhones for the marketing team.
It's not just the agency
it's
world. I've had that in. So back in the day, one of the things we bought was basically repossession agencies. This is in the automotive finance business. Right. And it was during the recession, lots of folks taking cars and unfortunately didn't have the means to pay for them. So it was a booming business. We did something like that and got exactly the same back. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the more glamorous advertising agencies that are doing that. Repo agencies were doing it too. It's like, what am I going to do with all this stuff?
But then the market leading intermediary started awarding prizes for the most creative RFI.
Right.
Which is encouraging that behaviour.
Yes.
Now, at the part of the pitch process, when you're maybe talking to 10 agencies to get basic information about their company and up-to-date information about their size and scope and reach and whatever, to ask them to make that kind of investment when they probably don't know what their odds are of winning, and you haven't even given them a brief yet, seems perverse. Mm-hmm. They should have the lowest possible effort and cost threshold at the beginning of a process when you just want information, on the basis that as their odds improve through a process which is essentially a process of deselection, that you then get to the one that you want at the end of that process, at which point the cost of competing at the end is going to be a lot higher when your odds are that much better. On the most basic level, that makes sense.
Now, do you think that why are agencies doing that, or why are all companies doing that? Are they being signaled to that this is important, or are they just are they taking the decision on their own as this is a way to demonstrate what we're capable of because we have an opportunity and someone's listening?
Part of it is that the procurement community, particularly, not least driven by the strategy that if you've got a strategic buy, then actually you want to convince them that they're commoditized so you can buy in a leveraged manner. I mean, if that's the case in a sort of commoditized business where you can ensure quality measures, then fine. But that's been reapplied, and now the agency world is convinced that it's massively oversupplied. Right. And I don't believe it is, because by the time you eradicate agencies that are too big, too small, have competitors, haven't got the scope that you need, you usually end up with a handful, which are then differentiated by their ability to meet that brief. Mm-hmm. So, there's an irony insofar as you say that there's an argument that the agency market is oversupplied, but nonetheless, we have this brilliant way in which we can specifically differentiate for you, and it's called a pitch. Yeah. So there's kind of a paradox there. So if I look at how we approach the post office, this was a tricky piece of business. On the one hand, it's an attractive large brand that many agencies would be interested in. On the other hand, it had a number of different products, each of which needs a different strategy and a different proposition and different communication. So rather than being one brand, it's actually one brand on a number of different products. So it's not under the surface as quite as attractive as it appear on the surface. Mm-hmm. So being aware of that was one of the first things. The second challenge that was part of that was that it was a public procurement process. So there was a degree of diligence and accountability and transparency that process needed, plus it needed to adhere to EU law in public procurement. So the challenges of managing a pitch process strategically within those constraints was no small thing. However, it was possible to navigate between the need for motivating and finding agency talent for the post office and the rigor of price competition that was demanded by the others. Some of the ways were fairly straightforward. One, for example, was starting with a conversation with each of the long list agencies, of which there were 8, as I recall, saying this is our business problem. Mm-hmm. This is where this business needs to be in 2020. We're looking for somebody who's going to help us with that and go on that journey. And they're suddenly, wow, you're sharing the big stuff. Yeah. So you're not looking for a brand awareness increase. You're looking for transformation. This is fantastic. So that got them excited. The second thing was, this is the process that we want to employ to select that agency, and being really specific about how we were going to do it. And then when we said that that's what we're going to do, that's what we did. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of the time, processes change because the decisions become a little bit tough. Yeah. Oh, it's really difficult to make a call between these top 2 agencies. Let's have them go again. Yeah. No, make a decision. That's really not fair. Yeah. You can't say, well, you've kind of won at roulette, but you nearly didn't, and therefore we're going to just make the ball roll again. Yeah. Oh, we've decided you both look really hungry, so we're just going to have one more round of negotiations. Exactly. I mean, it's just it doesn't engender the trust and mutuality that you need to establish in order to get best value from an agency. So that kind of transparency was really important. And one of the other ways that we did it is we made the process interesting. We tried to make it fun, and the way that the team conducted themselves, we were sort of accessible, we were flexible. A lot of the time, you'll find that clients will say, well, these are the dates and this is when you need to do it, and this is what's got. But for example, when we had tissue sessions, we noticed that part of the time between the brief and the first and the pitch was half term. So he said, well, if you got kids and you don't want to do it in half term, then we can do it the following week. Yeah. It's just natural and human, and probably what you'd do if you were working with them. Yeah. And when you show them that kind of understanding, they really appreciate it, because they think, oh, this is what it's going to be like to work on this business. So when you have some clients, and I saw it again last Christmas, despite writing articles to the contrary, who brief an agency before Christmas for a presentation in January and then go home and develop gout whilst sticking their feet up and stuffing themselves with mince pies while people are slavishly in the office on Christmas Eve and Boxing Day. Yeah. You kind of think, well, I don't want to build my career on working on a piece of business like this. Right. And it really doesn't work. Now, if you're a retail business, for example, that needs to test the mettle of your agency, absolutely fair enough. You need to test the mettle, but that isn't the way to do it in an exercise. There are different ways that you can approach that, and you need to think creatively about how you're going to do it. There's a difficulty for us in, where we go through RFIs and RFPs as well, just with the business that I have. And, I still see where procurement groups will send something out and it's like, don't talk to anybody. Here's a formal Q&A session, but we're not providing access. And I've been there, I've done it. That's how I would run some RFPs in the past, because the challenge we have is we don't want folks, stakeholders to send signals which, we feel impede our ability to get whatever, notionally the best deal for the company is. Who determines that is a whole different conversation. And so you try and, while you agree with transparency as the benefits of it, we're also afraid of the negatives in our mind of not being in control of the process. I think that's something we really struggle with, and I don't think we have a good answer yet for how we actually get around that. And a big part of that is that we have to change an entire taxonomy of how procurement thinks and works when it's managing investments rather than costs. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you think about it in the most basic analogy, if you, and I think we might have talked about this before, if you're accused of murder and you need representation in court, do you buy your barrister by the hourly rate, or do you go for the best available barrister that you can possibly afford?
Right. Yeah, the outcome is very important to you in that.
Right. Exactly. And actually, by paying for the best, finding the best, paying for the best, you're mitigating your risk of going to jail.
Yeah.
And we need to think about the risk of losing market share more like the risk of going to jail, rather than what's the least amount I can pay. I used an example in my negotiation training, which is that when Tango, that soft drink I referred to earlier, which I don't believe is in the States, but it was basically a humdrum, no different to any other soft drink. And the marketing director in the late 90s said, I want to relaunch this brand and I want to sell it like a beer. Mm-hmm. I want to use a kind of humour and grown up kind of humour and irreverence of a beer, which had never been done really before. And when he did that, the agencies were all over it, but they also needed to do a new pack. They also needed to redesign this tin can that the drink comes in. Yeah. And I said, there's two different ways you could do this. You could say to a bunch of packaging design agencies, how many people in which different jobs require how many hours to develop a packaging creative strategy and design and execute a design for this, and I'll be comparing you all on price. Or you can say, actually what I want to do is turn the whole drinks category upside down, so which is the best packaging agency in town? Mm-hmm. And why don't I go there? And as a proportion of my spend, it's a rounding error compared to what I'm going to be spending on media. So why don't I just double it? Yeah. Why don't I just say, instead of spending 40 grand on a packaging design, I'm going to say 80. Yeah. So I'm going to go into them, I'm going to tell them what I want, and I'll say, how much do you want? And if they say anything less than 80, then I'll say, fine, you can have it. But this has got to be absolutely breathtaking. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know how they bought the packaging design, but I do know from the person who researched it that when they researched it, and the background color of the can is black, and then it's got this burst of color according to the flavor of the drink that's in it. So a big orange burst for orange and a big green burst for apple and so on. And when they researched this this design, the groups went absolutely berserk. Half the people in the group absolutely loved it. Half the people in the group say, we would never drink out of a black can. This is absolutely disgusting. And the other half, no, of course we would drink out of it. And the client said to the researcher, okay, so we're going to have to scrap it. And he said, no, for heaven's sake, I've never seen anybody so passionate about packaging like this. And of course it was an unprecedented success in soft drinks.
You want reaction.
Everybody wanted to. Yeah, I mean, it was exactly. It broke rules. It did things differently. It is, to coin my metaphor, a gorilla. It's something that stops you in your tracks and really gets your attention. And if you want that, you have to do things inconsistently with current ideas of best practice.
So you've been involved in a lot of RFP processes in your time, I think now on both sides of the table.
Yes.
What has you consistently banging your head against a brick wall?
Where would you like me to start? Okay, so
we should do an entire podcast on that
number. There is one that's just come to me, which is box ticking. So box ticking infuriates me. Asking questions that you would not use to differentiate between suppliers.
Yeah.
And that aren't necessarily a pass-fail. So if it's pass-fail, fair enough. But if you wouldn't actually use it to differentiate a choice, just get rid of it. Mm-hmm. So that's a small one. But the big ones, the really big ones, are not determining the difference between a cost and an investment. And my very simple rule of thumb uses the expression that I used earlier, and that I would encourage everybody on all sides of this equation to use, which is the agency in this particular investment solving a problem with unlimited possible solutions, or very specific solutions. If those solutions are specific, it's a Sudoku puzzle, it's a crossword puzzle. There's only one right answer, and you can check the right answer, like artwork, for example. Then, yes, that's a cost. It's something that's otherwise undesirable. If it could be anything, then it's an investment, and you need to treat investments differently to costs. So that's one. The second one would be this idea of savings. A big problem is that people in procurement outside of marketing are often in legitimate leverage buying strategies and are incented personally to make savings to hit a bonus for them at the end of the year. So I've hit my savings in cost savings and cost avoidance. I've done all of that. It's verified, and therefore I get my bonus. But if you're doing that with an investment, you're just buying less for less, or you're increasing your risk, and you don't know which. And a financial saving that comes at a commercial loss as a consequence of that saving is not a saving, it's a loss. So there's a lot of people who are inadvertently working against the best interests of their organization. So, for example, I wrote an article about working versus non-working expenditure, where working expenditure is considered as sales, promotion and media, where sales can be directly ascribed to that investment, and non-working is agency fees, original production and so on. When I wrote an article about that, saying that these need to be protected as investments, and I posted that on LinkedIn, 2 or 3 people in my procurement network wrote to me and said, you know what, absolutely agree with you, but there's no way I'm going to bite the hand that feeds. So people are knowingly harming their investments because that's what they're incentivized to do. And that's a big problem. And the last one is this obsession with time. And that there is a distinction to be made between time, effort and value. Because you can pay me for an hour and I won't necessarily try very hard and I can produce value. You can pay me for an hour and I can try terribly hard and be rubbish at what I do and not produce value. There isn't a direct relationship between time and effort and value. The best story, and you might have seen this as a meme from time to time, but I traced it back and put put it in my book, which is about a guy who was called the Wizard of Schenectady, Charles Proteus Steinmetz.
Okay.
And he was an engineer who worked for General Electric, and General Electric was headquartered in Schenectady in Upper New York State. I think it still is. But anyway, the Ford company had some GE generators in its plant, and one of them wasn't working properly. And Steinmetz was asked to come and solve it. And he was a strange man with a very individual approach insofar as he came along with a camp bed and a notebook and a pencil. And he stayed next to the generator day in, day out for 3 days, climbing up and down ladders, listening to the generator, making notes in his book that no one else would understand but him. And after 3 days, he took out a piece of chalk, he climbed up the generator and put an X on the outside of the generator, and then instructed Ford to open the generator there and recalibrate X, Y, and Z, and that the generator would work again. So they did that, and it worked, and they received an invoice from General Electric for $10,000. And Ford himself, according to the story, saw the invoice and said, "This is ridiculous, I want some sort of breakdown," and asked for a breakdown from them. And when it went back to Steinmetz, he said, let me deal with this one personally. So Steinmetz personally rewrote the invoice, and it read, "To make a mark on your generator to identify where your engineers need to do the work, $1. To know where to make the mark on your generator, $9,999. And it might have been 3 days' work, but the utility of that work, the fact that it got the factory back going again, the fact that it got the cars rolling off the production line again, all of these things are actually what determines value, not whether or not it was a hard task or took a short amount of time or a long amount of time. There's a very It's essentially a Marxist approach to value, which is that value is the same as effort, and it or is determined by effort, and it absolutely is not. All you need is Picasso to draw on a napkin in 20 seconds, and you'd know that it isn't about effort.
Yeah, it's we mentioned it earlier, and when we talked about there's value and there's it's worth paying for speed. And we sometimes think of speed as being, that means they're going to put double the people on the account. And that's not what we mean. It's that, you're going to act smarter. And you're actually, by doing something, there's actually financial benefits that will accrue faster because you've been quicker.
Absolutely.
And it's not just... Sorry, go ahead.
I remember I worked 20 years ago with creative teams, and you would need to sort of go in and brief them, and 3 weeks later they give you the first idea, and then say, I really need something for next week, and so on. And this was not working on the business that I was on, which really needed much faster turnaround. It was much more like a retail piece of business. So finally I was given access to the retail team that we had there, and I went in to see them on a Monday morning with a brief and said, okay, so this is the brief. When should I come back to you? And they said, what? 3, 4, and I said, days? He said, hours. And 3 or 4 hours, I came back and they said, well, we've got these 6 different routes.
Yeah.
And I was speechless. So you've been here all along. Oh yeah. But if you're paid by the hour, if I pay my builder by the hour to build a specific wall, it's going to take him a lot longer than if I build him if I pay him for a wall.
Right.
But if I pay him for a wall and he can actually do it a lot faster than I thought, all to the good.
Yeah.
Because that's how much the wall is worth to me, and we need to completely change the way that we're thinking about effort and value. Because in doing so, you're incenting the agency to produce the highest possible value as efficiently as they can. And when they are, as a result of that, profitable through you, then you're improving your supplier preference, and you're improving the stability and the employer brand of your partner agency. So it's a win-win-win all round.
So I want to finish on incentives, actually, and we've talked a lot about different approaches of going to market, of how risk forms or risk mitigation forms such a big part of the procurement process, especially in creative work when it's not particularly clear what we're buying or what the output is going to be, and there's so much trust that is kind of placed on an agency to deliver. Are there ways that you've seen be successful of incenting an agency that minimizes your risk throughout that process, in this environment where you are kind of putting a lot of faith in the agency that you select?
There's a lot of, again, this misnomer best practice around incentivizing agencies. I've seen lots of different models that include, I want to bonus the agency, but only the people in my team. Models that include the payment of a bonus of up to 15% and a malus, which is essentially a penalty off a base fee of minus 10%. Right. And these have been kicked around a lot. They are oftentimes fundamentally flawed insofar as clients don't want to pay for the thing that they're using to get best performance. Now, I've suggested on a few occasions that if your marketing director was personally bonused on their ability to prove that their agency deserved full bonus, then you would have a much more interesting dynamic, because that means the marketing director has to demonstrate that he or she got the best possible value contribution from their advertising resources. Now, surely that is a much better idea than, when I ran an agency, 2 blue chip clients had described our operation as the best that they've experienced in the world, in all of their markets. And both of them, in our assessment, gave us 4s out of 5 on all criteria of agency performance. And when we went back and said 4 out of 5, best in the world, help me out here.
Right.
Do you have agencies on another planet in another solar system? because surely if we're the best, that makes us a 5. Right. And the answer was, well, we don't give 5s. Now, there's something clearly wrong there, because you have to want to pay an incentive.
Yeah.
So, for example, in the, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, one of the things that we did in the post office pitch is that we said to the agencies, this is the fee that we want to pay you in advance of in advance of them giving us numbers. We gave them a number, so we want to pay you X, and this is the amount of bonus that we want to be available to you, for which we have budgeted.
Yeah.
So this is a budgeted bonus that we want to pay you for satisfying X, Y, and Z criteria that we'll agree. So we have to again think about investment rather than cost. And if it's a carrot, it's got to be a tasty, achievable, lovely carrot that the agencies want to get.
Yeah.
But incentives like that, again, I'd go back to what I said earlier. If your incentive was not just wrapped around, you did a status report within 36 hours of such and such, and these things which are, yes, it's good practice and good communication, but is it directly contributing to what the agency's value is? That's not maybe the best thing. Right. But if you were to say, plus there's an extra £15,000 if you pick up silver or gold in can, plus there's if you started thinking and talking with your agencies like that, then the amount of effort you'll get over and above that which you're paying for is going to be incalculable.
Yeah, to find out what's important to them.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we tend not to do is to say, what's the best way? I mean, if you start your relationship with an agency of saying, what's the best way to get the best value out of you? What do I need to do? Mm-hmm. What are the circumstances I need to create to get the very best out of you? And then take that as your first guiding star for how you're going to work together. You're going to get a better result than to go in and say, well, really glad that you won the pitch. This is how we work. Do what we say.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just doesn't make any sense.
No, it makes total sense. And yet I see it so rarely,
Exactly.
Because you're helping, and the answers may show you things that, I'm not prepared to give that. I'm not prepared to do that to help you be successful, and that's fine, because that's part of the process. But it sets everybody up for success. The other thing that I really struggle with now that I'm on the other side of the table, and I understand, of course, why I spent years and years and years hiding this stuff from potential suppliers, is talking about budgets. You talked about sharing that I have this amount of money, what can I get for it? And you can even tier it to say, hey, I'm kind of thinking about there's certain levels of budget and we're not sure where we're going to be able to get the investment from, depends on the ROI, all this stuff. So you're not necessarily giving up the keys to the castle in terms of negotiation. But when people come to me and say, this is the amount of money I've got, I can be far more creative in coming up with ways to help you spend that to get the best results versus this is what I want.
Absolutely.
And I have no idea how to price that. And so I'll price it high.
Absolutely. If all of the principles in my How to Buy a Guerrilla framework start with having a shared interest between marketing, procurement, and agencies, and until you have that shared interest, because at the moment the interests can be at best divergent and at worst mutually exclusive. Procurement want to save money, marketing want to spend money, agencies want more money, marketing don't trust agencies not to be dragging their feet, and that their creativity is to their own need. Procurement are trying to defend their business against the irresponsible marketers and the smoke and mirrors agencies. This is as one of my reviewers called it, an unholy trinity. And until we can say this is what collectively we're trying to do, you're throwing potentially not just the millions of pounds that you're investing in marketing, in TV media and its effectiveness. You're throwing the consequence of that to your ROI into a triangle which doesn't have a shared interest of what it is that they're trying to achieve on a business level. And that's what needs to fundamentally change before everything else can. Because you can't change any of those practices individually. All of it's got to change in order to be able to flip what is a defensive, protective, downward spiral of value erosion into a creative, constructive upward spiral of value creation. And it can be done with those professionals in those corners. We just need to look at the other end of the telescope to see how to do it. Oh, or, of course, read a book.
Well, on that note, David.
You see what I did there?
Yeah, I've teed you up.
Take the man out of the agency.
Well, it's perfect timing, actually, because it's with it being time to wrap up. I always have a final question of where listeners can go to find out more, to learn a little bit more about your work, to connect with you personally. So, perfect opportunity for you to kind of give listeners some idea of how they can connect with you, beyond the podcast.
What an elegant segue that is. Yeah. Yes, you can find me at www.htbag.co.uk, htbag being how to buy a gorilla. You can find out more about me and my thinking in the book, How to Buy a Gorilla, which is on Amazon.com and .co.uk and .ca and .eu. So it's all Amazoned up. So yes, by all means, you can get in touch with me through the website. Please do. I'd love to hear from anybody who wants to know more, to see how I can help sort of get that value creation. Well, put a rocket underneath it, basically. Yeah. Those big brands with the big ambitions.
Well, David, what I'll do is I'll share those in our show notes so people don't have to furiously scribble those down while driving into work or on a run or wherever they may be listening to the pod.
Excellent.
And also some of the links to things that you referenced, like some of the ads that you talked about.
Yes.
Some of the articles. I'm going to collect all those up in the show notes. So those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/gorilla. That's artofprocurement.com/gorilla. David, thank you very much for sharing your perspectives, your experiences with our audience. I think it's a conversation that certainly transcends marketing and advertising agencies. It's very specifically relevant, I think, to all creative work, but also beyond that in terms of how we start to rethink how we go to market for a lot of the things we buy. So a lot of food for thought.
Indeed. Great. Thanks very much indeed. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, David.
Cheers.
Hi there, Art of Procurement listeners. It's Phil here, and I'm excited to share with you the new offer we've been working on. It's called the Catalyst Co-Platform, or TCP. So TCP is a distillation, curation, and contextualization of all the conversations we've had here at Art of Procurement and through our weekly newsletter. We also incorporate the content of others from both inside and outside of our community. And TCP, it's all about taking action. It's about leveling up. It's about enhancing our impact as a community and as individual professionals. The TCP provides a safe space and tools that we can use to generate value for our teams and for ourselves. It brings structure and what we call facilitated accountability to the way that we learn, develop, and validate new ideas. Based on the work we've done in the enterprise space and the feedback that we've received from many in the community, we designed TCP with a bias towards dynamic, actionable content and interactions that require no more than a few minutes of your time every day. It's not about checking boxes, and it's not for everyone. But if you're the kind of professional that sees themselves as a catalyst and prioritizes effectiveness over productivity, then TCP may be for you. We are now taking applications for early access to our flagship TCP program. This early access program will be only available between now and September the 15th, and it's limited to just 50 individuals. For the early access application, or to find out more about our team and enterprise versions, please go to artofprocurement.com/TCP. That's artofprocurement.com/TCP, or click the link in the sidebar of the artofprocurement.com homepage. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next week.